Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Welcome to this edition of Softcover. Today we have with us author Pranay Lal, who has just come out with a new book with Penguin Random House called Invisible Empire, The Natural History of Viruses. Pranay, would you please hold up your book for us? That's the one. And the book delves into the world's most abundant life form, its history and evolution, which is, of course, the virus. The book is a very informative piece of science writing and goes deep into viruses, the kingdom of life, history, and paints a very compelling picture about how viruses have shaped the course of life on Earth, as well as human civilization. Pranay, many congratulations on Invisible Empire. It is absolutely unputdownable. I loved it thoroughly, and I found it very fascinating how the book goes into so many different domains and explores how viruses shape them. Of course, there's a raging, ongoing global pandemic, but right in the middle of the pandemic just yet, can I ask what prompted you to write a book about viruses in the first place?
First of all, thank you, Sandhya, for inviting me to talk to you and your listeners. So it was a very strange time. I think it was in March last year that Sanjoy Roy and Namita Gokhale reached out to me and asked me if I would do a talk on COVID and what was happening and if I could make any sense of it. And, since January, a few of us, a lot of doctor friends and people who follow epidemiology in the organization I work, we had been talking about this raging epidemic in China. And, all our predictions were coming completely wrong and haywire. And, the models that we were trying to create, the early assumptions that we were making were completely, over the top. And so when Namita and Sanjoy came up with this idea that I should do a talk on COVID and the epidemic, I said, I don't want to eat any more of the humble pie that I've already gulped enough of. So I positioned to them that, perhaps I should do a talk on viruses in general and why I like viruses, and they said, are you really saying that? I mean, do you really want to, be a contrarian for the heck of it? And I said, no, I've got some interesting stories to tell you. And I think, you might be, I'd like to, share some thoughts. And so, we did that talk and then a podcast followed. And the podcast actually did create a lot of flutter because, immediately after that, the podcast, which happened in end of May last year, I had offers from, publishing houses to transcribe it and see if...
And this was, I'm sorry, Pawan Srinath's podcast.
That's right, yes, that's the one.
Okay.
Pawan Srinath for the Bangalore International Center. And it became a bit viral, if I could say that. And, there were publishers who wanted to, for me to, give them the rights to just transcribe it. And I said, by itself, it's only 22,000 words when it got transcribed. So I said that, perhaps I should, venture in embellishing the text with some more anecdotes and some more fleshing it in and fleshing it out, and also adding some images, because if I'm going to talk about, say, tulips or the history of smallpox or other things, I think, there are some amazing illustrations, cartoons, maps, diagrams, which I thought should have been there. So basically, this is a contrarian view on what is happening in the world today. While the world is in complete disarray and dismay because of a singular creature that's just emerged, there are viruses which have played, like you said in your introduction, have played an immense role in the evolution of life itself. And I thought that's something to celebrate, and I thought I'd put that in the form of a story.
And the book has done a really good job of it. It goes into a lot of detail about not just the evolution of viruses, but also their origin and how they fit in the kingdom of life. It does a very fascinating job as well. I actually find the book very evocative of even Bill Bryson. It's so chock full of interesting tidbits and facts on every page. Some of them really stood out to me, like the fact that 42% of our genome is made up of jumping genes that are move about. And even the striated patterns in Dutch tulips that you've mentioned, which are, of course, not bred anymore. So over the course of your research for the book, Was there anything that you learned, any interesting fact that really stood out to you and kind of blew your mind?
Um, well, that's a hard question because for somebody who loves microbes and the microbial world, there's no favorite. I think a lot of stories, all of them are integral to the story of life. There were some discoveries, and which actually they updated my thought process immensely. And one of them was a paper that got published in September last year in Nature. And it reported for the first time about these viruses that are found quite like Rip Van Winkle lying in our, inside our neurons and nerves, which just do not seem to awaken. And and what purpose do they serve there, other than just using humans for replicating from one, passing it down generations. So there is a function, a utility function that they would serve, but we still haven't figured out what they are. And there's each year we add anything between 2 to 7 new viruses that are found in our bodies without doing any perceptible damage. They are natural residents in our bodies. So what are they doing there? And I find that interesting, and the fact that they live within us and perhaps do so much, that made me really sit up. And I don't think that just because one virus has set the world in a tizzy, we need to cast all viral kingdom, the entire viral kingdom, into by putting it aside and saying all of them are bad. It's like, I think that's completely humbug, and I think we need to set the record straight.
And I think you've done a good job of it, especially with cultural context and how viruses have played a role in different societies and cultures as well. I remember the images of Shitala Mata that you had included in the book. Those were really fascinating. And there were also a number of other really wonderful photographs and diagrams and just images. It has good historical ones also. So can you walk us through a little bit about what the process was like to obtain these images and get the images that you decided you wanted?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Actually, I'm a bit of a magpie. So, and I'm also visual in the sense that I like to, think about my story, not just in terms of the story that I'm going to say, but also, can I say it better in pictures or on a map or, something like that. So I'd like to lay out my book mentally. So my research for pictures and images and maps begins almost simultaneously as my text is evolving, as my research and reading begins. Of course, you encounter a lot of it or reference to it while you're reading papers or reading texts, and you keep a note of those things. But you also want to bring up or research for new things that others may not have encountered. So I try to find things like which are a little more novel. For example, the death certificate of Mozart. It's never been published. I mean, it has been published, but I think in one biography, a German biography on Mozart, and we had to write to the rector of the St. Stephen's Church in Vienna and try to get the original one, a copy of it. So that's fascinating, and I think it actually specifies there that he died of a disease, which I talk about in my book. It's not been written much about. I think there are about a clutch of papers, about 20 of them. It's an evolving field. It's a new viral disease that emerged in the late 14th, 15th century, and then suddenly vanished. And that's what I write about. A virus vanishes. So yeah, it's been very interesting. And like I say, I keep telling people that I ferret for information. I'm a bit of a parasite. I kind of suck out information from every person I interview, and I say, give me more, give me something exciting. So I'm a bit of a pain for a lot of people I reach out to.
Well, that's what makes a great book for sure. And you had also mentioned Mozart, and I also read that very throwaway line that you had mentioned with the Stradivarius and the Guarneri violins and how the climate shaped them. And it's very nice. There are all of these random tidbits that come together in the book. It's overall extremely cohesive, and I like the the small, interesting tidbits you put here and there. But since they have played such an important role throughout our history as well, and of course, now we are in a very unprecedented scale of a pandemic, but we've had pandemics before, we've had large viral illnesses before, and we have seen patterns in how people react to public health measures that are taken. So, what do you think? What are some lessons that we can learn from history to, especially to tackle this growing anti-vax and almost an anti-science sentiment right in the middle of a terrifying global pandemic?
I think that's a great question, and I don't think there's an easy answer because it involves a lot of stakeholders, a lot of players involved in it. Of course, there are. I think the template of it is the government and society itself. I think globally, governments have stopped funding fundamental basic research and science communication per se. And there has been an overwhelming interest in technology, and without telling the basics of what the science is behind the technology. That's one problem that I think exists globally. I mean, there are institutions, for example, you've got the Royal Institutes and Royal Societies in England, you've got the National Academies in the US. In India, I think we've had a very frail infrastructure when it comes to scientific understanding. I think that's where we need to be investing in, because the scientists did not really stand up. I mean, you had one Fauci who stood up and spoke on behalf of, I think, the rest of the world. And he was, as you know, brandished with so many other expletives and names. So I think there've got to be champions from within the scientific community who need to stand up and call out, the hegemony of politicians. That's one aspect of it. The second thing is that given that social media, the way it has been operating, I think rumors and small pieces of information amplify hugely. And you find misinformation that, for example, Andrew Wakefield's measles paper on, it causes, various neural problems, the famous paper on measles, the effect of measles vaccine. That was circulating, and somebody needs to call out within that group saying that this is a paper that has been retracted. It's been called bunkum, and why is it that it's being circulating in possibly even circles where I've seen quite a few literate people and people from the medical fraternity as well, who kind of did not call out on it, and I think that's something that somebody needs to stand up and stop that the flow of misinformation, that infodemic when it's starting. So infodemic also is like an epidemic. It's like an outbreak. You've got to stop it when it starts. So that's one problem with technology, information technology per se. And I think it's easy for people who are not in, in the realm of the science or understanding the larger context of the vaccine or the way the vaccine works or the way the epidemic plays out. I think what has happened is that we have not been able to communicate the right messages to these people. And the central premise here is that emotions short circuits logic or curiosity or questioning of basic premise of why certain things happen the way they do. I mean, if I were an economist, I would tell, or if I were in the government, for example, I would say this to the people of India or anywhere in the world. Think about it. We spent far more in terms of treating patients, and that's households. People went bankrupt because they had to treat their loved ones, right? The cost of vaccine and adverse vaccine events, if you were to play it out in the long term, no matter which vaccine you take, of course, there are bad ones also. I mean, I can think of one drug like thalidomide, which was perhaps a drug that should not have been approved for its for what it was. But there are very few such medicines or medical interventions that have gone completely wrong, right? COVID vaccines, none of them would have done what they have, whether it was coming out from a country that was looking suspicious or did not have the robust clinical trial data that should be available to people. So I think the suspicion of various things played out together. And finally, I think governments themselves, if you notice, a lot of governments fell into a precipice staring at autocracy, or even fell from slightly democratic to absolutely undemocratic. I mean, freedom of speech and expression was curbed, lockdowns happened, which were pretty unscientific at times, but some of them were essential. All those things also played on the minds of the people. And because civil liberties were compromised and information flow from reliable sources did not exist, doctors were getting arrested or imprisoned. That was another very, very serious thing that creates a suspicion in people that why is this happening? So I think it is an interplay of several things that happened. The vaccine hesitancy is not a problem of a single community or a region or a single class of people. I think it runs across. The prevalence exists, but the prevalence may vary across different strata. But I think the problem is largely manifested by how governments, institutions, international institutions. I think there's a collective failure of international institutions also in the way they should have communicated about vaccines. So I think it's a very large debate, but I think it starts from the realm of the trust and mistrust between governments, pharmaceutical sector, international organizations, civil society, media itself. I think we are all at fault, and we now need to examine how we want to communicate science in a better way.
And big tech definitely has a big role to play here as well. You had mentioned thalidomide, which I'm sure not a lot of people are familiar with the birth defects and all of that. But everybody is familiar with Wakefield's study about MMR and autism, and it was completely falsified and released under such terrible circumstances. But once the wave gets a grip of people, it spreads much more rapidly than facts.
That's right.
And countering it has to be a very systematic process.
That's right.
Yeah. Another thing that I was interested in knowing is about from your work, where do you think the future of the field of microbial research is heading? You had talked about endoretroviruses from xenotransplantation, for example, and now, of course, we had that successful temporary pig transplant for a while. And you've also spoken about microbial resistance. So given the advancement that we're making in the field of medicine, medical applications and science, and in general, microbial research, where do you think the next big thing is going to be in viral and, well, microbial research in general?
I think, although we stand at a very interesting point in both in terms of technology and discovery of fundamental science, like CRISPR, for example, or even the fact that, although the certain Chinese scientists had shown that xenotransplantation was possible, and the more recent one that happened in the US, they're exciting things. I mean, no doubt about that. But I think let's step back, and I think what I talk about in my last chapter is using nature to and deploying nature to fight things that come out or manifest themselves or fester in ways that we now need to control. And what I'm particularly interested in microbiomes, human microbiomes. I think the assault of chemicals and antibiotics and supplements and even foods. We need to understand how so many chronic conditions that are developing are possibly the manifestation of churnings that are happening in our microbiome. I think we need to understand that better. We did not know till about a decade ago that the most dominant bacteria, or even the most common virus that lived in our guts, crass assembly phage, was not even discovered. So I think those kind of things, we now need to know ourselves better. Only then can we talk about treatment and better regimes of medicines and better vaccines. I think this is where we need to begin. We now need to start looking inwards and also look at how we can deploy the microbial kingdom to correct problems that exist. I'm particularly interested in looking at climate change, looking at how we could look at burying carbon by looking at reviving ponds, rivers, and ocean systems. and how can we look at the whole process of understanding the biogeochemical cycles. I think that's going to be something very, very fascinating in the future.
But often when I write about stories, I sort of tend to sense that we're just at the cusp of these developments into understanding what these microbes are that break down organic matter and plastic, and how they could be harnessed potentially. And also in terms of what you mentioned about gut microbiome, I think the research is just coming up right now, and we're finding out about the benefits of things like vaginal birth and breastfeeding and things like that from our gut microbiota itself. And yeah, that does promise to be a very, it holds promise, a lot of promise in the future, I'm sure. Can I ask you if you could talk about any of your upcoming work now after Invisible Empire?
Right. Invisible Empire was something that happened over 1 year, and it was an opportune moment because I was immersed in writing 2 other books, and I think much to the dismay of my publisher, I positioned this book, and they were kind of surprised. I mean, of course, they thought that this was also an opportunity, but the fact that I had 2 other books in the pipeline, and there are. So the next book that I'm going to write is on the Malabar, the natural history of Malabar, and I want to possibly write detailed accounts of the natural history of regions of India. And I'm actually very happy to support somebody else who wants to write it, because it's monumental, in the sense that it's also deeply encumbering, that the fact that I have set myself this task that I want to write different regions of India, that it's going to be quite a task to do that. So I'm starting with Malabar, and then I want to migrate to other parts of India and say that this is the natural history. If you want to understand this part of India, this is what it looks like. So that's next in terms of a book. I'm also working on a children's book called Cretaceous. It's going to be fascinating because the text is by and large ready. We are working on the artwork, and it's been in the pipeline for some time. So has Malabarica. Actually, Malabarica should have come out last year, had floods and repeated outbreaks in Kerala not happened and stymied my plans for travel. But I'm hoping that I'm able to resume my travel and I finish those small pieces of things, that sites that I want to visit and look at rocks or life forms that I've been wanting to see. I can do that very quickly and finish Malabarica.
I'm really looking forward to reading all about the Western Ghats and the coconut trade and spices and everything there. And of course, Cretaceous sounds fantastic. I'm looking forward to reading the kids' book, and I can imagine the scope that it has for fantastic artwork. And of course, going into the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction and all of that. Sounds very exciting. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Pranay. And unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you for your time and for this extremely insightful and wonderful discussion, and many, many congratulations on the book. I look forward to discussing the book with my colleagues and friends and poring over all of these interesting facts and pictures with them. My best wishes for your launch, and I do hope we're able to speak with you again, both for Malabar as well as for Cretaceous. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.